of training. And it was really primarily developed to be used in post-secondary and higher education. The idea behind it was really to try to prevent moments of harm. And it really originally focused mostly on sexual assault, relationship violence, stalking, and then also alcohol abuse and issues of hazing. In the past 8 years, so in about the past decade, we've really seen a shift where this curriculum has now been used to also address moments of harm with racism, homophobia, transphobia, other identity-related microaggressions, and it's actually even been adopted to use when we're thinking about things like environmental harm. So this is a training that has been really broadly adapted to be really addressing how do we become a community that cares and actually intervenes and prevents harm from happening. Unlike other trainings, I think something that's really important that we highlight about bystander training is that unlike other trainings, we are really focusing on the power of a bystander being able to take action. So for us to understand that, I think we need to start with what is a bystander. So if folks would like to, go ahead and in the chat, feel free to write down what you think a bystander is. Anything that comes to mind, maybe some initial word associations, anything that is coming up. And Saeed, if you want to maybe read one or two for us, that would be great.
Yeah, we've got words like a nearby witness, a participant in the conversation, an observer, an interrupter, a lot of observer actually coming in, an observer of something. And then some like different titles. So even folks like a colleague of mine, a friend, a witness, those sorts of things.
Thank you. Absolutely, right? I think all of that is part of what a bystander is, and definition will reflect what you've all written. A bystander is someone who observes a moment, but isn't directly involved. And they can make the choice to be active or to be passive. Something that's important, so it's not usually the person who's directly perpetuating the harm in the moment, nor is it the person who's maybe being directly impacted by the harm, but it's someone who's in the periphery. So it could be someone, I thought those were great examples. So it could be a colleague who's overhearing a conversation. It could be someone passing by a situation. But regardless, it's someone who's noticing this moment and then really has a choice to make. Either they choose to say, I don't see anything, or that's just normal behavior and I'm gonna keep going on with my day, or they say this is something that's potentially harmful and now I have an opportunity to check in or to intervene. So that's what we're going to spend some time on today.
So this next piece we want to get into is just framing a little bit more of the conversation. So remembering that bystander intervention is a practice of prevention, but we'll get into that a little bit more specific because there's different ways to intervene, and there can even be a way to intervene after something has happened. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but just remembering that overall this program and programs like it are designed to really address prevention. So before something happens, right? This also matters for us, obviously, because we are leaders and we have a platform and an influence in our different circles. So whether it's at Northwestern or when you leave Northwestern, right? When you step outside of Northwestern, you're also a potential bystander. You're also have potential power in specific situations to really address wrongdoing that you might see or notice events that could potentially lead to harm, right? As Jennifer talked about before, things like microaggressions, lack of belonging, these hostile environments really do prevent us from learning and engaging the best that we can. We've seen a lot of examples from in care. We meet with students confidentially, and one of the things we do know is just how much being on the receiving end of harm, whether it be based on race, gender identity, those sorts of things, regardless of what it is, just how much that can really impact negatively our student experiences. And that goes beyond students. Obviously, that goes to just people in public as well, right? So some things to sort of remember or at least recognize for our purposes today is we don't have a ton of information that is relevant to what is what do bystander behaviors and actions look like for us at Northwestern in particular? So there's limited amount of polls about our bystander intervention behaviors just as staff and faculty at Northwestern. We do have some statistics, some information about students and their level of engagement in bystander behavior, specifically around violence of some kind. But the important thing to remember is whether we're talking about the Northwestern community or just research really looking at bystander intervention, one of the things that we do know is that a large majority of folks, when witnessing a situation where being a bystander would be beneficial, do notice something. They do, maybe an antenna goes off, something sort of picks up for them. I know that also depends at times on age and experience and identities, things that we'll get into. But we know, for instance, for our students at Northwestern, about 80% of our students would say that I can identify that a situation is needing a bystander to be helpful, right? And that number is kind of consistent around different studies, different locations, and not just students, folks that are staff and faculty as well. One of the things, though, that really does impact whether we engage in bystander intervention or not, however, is, are we actually noticing something as problematic? Are we noticing something where, and then if we're all are noticing that something is problematic or in need of a bystander, are we unintentionally contributing to the escalation of an issue as opposed to de-escalating it? So that's something that we can really get into as well. Some important behaviors to kind of recognize is that depending on our identities, we also may be engaging or not engaging in bystander intervention. So something to remember is that folks who identify as cis men in particular, but cis men in particular across undergraduate and graduate men, as well as professionals, tend to intervene in very direct ways as opposed to very indirect ways. So you'll see, based on simple gender identity and other demographics, you may be more likely to engage in direct bystander intervention as opposed to passive, which, you know, that's something we'll get into here in a little bit, as opposed to when you compare that to non-cis individuals, those in our in other, like, more targeted identities. So those who hold identities around, being Black, Asian, these sorts of other demographics also tend to ask for more help when it comes to bystander intervention, as opposed to those you would deem having more systemic power, tend to actually ask for less help. And so this is something that we're really going to get into, is recognizing your own power and spheres of influence, and how is that impacting your ability to intervene. And lastly, just something to frame what we're talking about today. We actually know in some studies that race is a very big key contributor to bystander intervention, in that Black people and Black individuals in general are less likely to receive help from white people, even when you control for the same or similar situations. And so we see that race is a big contributing factor of who even we deem worthy of being able to help. And this discrepancy only increases when it takes more perseverance or more work on the part of that white bystander to actually help that Black person who's being impacted by something. So again, race, culture, these identities are really going to come into play when it comes to some of this stuff. I think we can move forward from there. So just framing some of the agenda here is getting into what is that active bystander, what does that mean to be an active bystander, some of our prevention strategies that we'll get into. So we hope you leave with specific tools to be able to help you intervene and recognize when to intervene. And then we're going to end with some practice today. But the overall goal is to move folks from being more passive or being more observer bystander to being very active and more engaged. Cool.
So to get us started in the process of being an active bystander, we have kind of 5 steps to taking action as a bystander, and we're going to go through each one of these. The first one is noticing an event. So this is a pretty simple, again, idea, but we'll unpack it a little bit more. But for us as bystanders, if we're going to do something, the very first thing is we have to notice there's something going on. The second thing is that we actually have to interpret that as being a problem. So not just did we see that moment, but we're actually saying that could be a harmful moment, that could be a problematic moment for us. And then we need to assume personal responsibility. So not only do we now need to interpret it as a problem, but we actually have to say, I need to do something, and it's my job and responsibility to intervene in this moment. After that, we get to step 4, which is knowing how to help. So actually having those strategies, which we'll spend some time on, and then implementing the help. So again, a very simple process that we go through, but thinking about it consciously helps us be a much more active and intentional bystander.
For sure. And so to the point that Cho just made and that I just made a little bit earlier as well, is that even noticing the event, it sounds so simple. It sounds so, you know, of course I'll notice. But what we do find even in our research is that it really depends on a number of things, whether you'll even notice or interpret something as an issue. And a big thing that influences that is just how you're showing up to a situation. What identities, experiences, and different contexts do you bring into a potential bystander intervention situation? And so we know that identities such as your gender, religion, sexuality, age, all of these different things that you're bringing into that space really do matter when it comes to what you're noticing as even a problem. If I don't do some of my own internal work, if I don't do some like empathy building, if I don't do some more research for myself and my own identities, then I may not even understand the implications of what I'm witnessing because I have never experienced it myself before or even seen something like it before. Now, if I haven't seen or even know that something exists, how might I actually exert some sort of active bystander approaches to that situation? So we hope that when we go through these scenarios, one of the first things you'll do in terms of noticing an event is checking in with yourself about your own identities and what's going on for you before you actually intervene.
Absolutely. And for some of us who might be action oriented, some of building our lens could be doing that self work. So starting to just notice and track different identities as we move through our day, or starting to journal or read. As we move from the first step of noticing, then it's really about interpreting it as a problem. So this is actually a step that is simple, but people get really hung up on because often we get a very strong gut intuition feeling. We know something's up, something just feels off to us, but this is kind of where we tend to talk ourselves down, minimize the issue and say, you know, maybe I'm seeing things wrong. Like maybe I can't trust my own judgment of this moment. Maybe my bias is coming into play. Maybe I shouldn't intervene. And we have all of these reasons and barriers that come up. And for us in bystander intervention, something that's important is validating that those fears come up. It doesn't help us to just pretend they don't exist and say, let's jump into this no matter what. That's not true. We're all going to have different reasons or things that come up for us, whether that is fear of consequences of intervening, or personal safety is a fear in actually intervening in a moment and potentially having that violence turn on us. So for us, it's important to actually talk about what are the things that stop us so that we know, so that we can actually try to come up with some solutions, some strategies that help us get around that barrier, because there are always going to be reasons to not intervene. We need to have some reasons to intervene. So if you would like, we encourage, if you would like to, on your own journaling later, maybe think about some moments that you've intervened, that you have taken some action, but also think about some moments where you've gotten that gut feeling and you've chosen not to, and think about where that stems from. On this next slide, I've written down some of the ones that we hear really commonly in our trainings from students and a lot from faculty and staff. So some things that we often hear is that we get nervous because socially we're conditioned to not intervene in what we notice is maybe a personal thing happening or an interaction between two individuals. We don't feel kind of culturally always comfortable navigating that. Something else that happens is we second guess ourselves. We feel like maybe I don't know what to do in the moment. So I know something's happening, but I can't possibly think of what I could do that would stop this from happening. Some important ones, I think, as faculty and staff, really thinking about whether it's my place. So I think often as faculty and staff, we're taught to have a lot of boundaries with students. And so it can kind of be a weird thing to feel like, oh, I actually should be intervening in student interaction or student culture. And then power comes up a lot. So Said mentioned around identity, but also around authority and role in our positions. So often as staff or faculty with varying levels of power and access to resources, we also feel nervous about creating tension or disrupting a workplace that we are in. So these are all some things. And then another one that I just also want to highlight before we move on, this is one of probably the biggest ones to think about, is the group culture. So when we are in a group, we have the potential of the bystander effect. And the bystander effect is really the idea that we are actually in a group less likely to act because there are more people. So we actually believe that it's someone else's responsibility, and we're going to kind of sit back and maybe think someone else has this diffusion of responsibility. We feel like someone else will take on that moment and intervene. Or in the silence of nobody intervening or doing something, we actually kind of collectively normalize this idea that this harm is okay, it's acceptable. And so in a weird kind of psychological way, we actually normalize the violence that's happening and choose to not intervene. So these all may be barriers for you. Maybe there's one that really resonates. But as you're thinking about intervention, think about what those barriers are. Really dig into where they come up from, and think about, is this something that I can change and maybe shift? It's not a barrier for me. Or if this is going to come up, then how do I take some other actions that won't make me hit up against this, so that I can still do something, even if it's not maybe exactly what I think would be perfect. What is the thing that I can do that can contribute to stopping that harm?
Thanks for that, Cho. Kind of moving into a third process, right? A third step in this is just assuming that personal responsibility. So it's not necessarily enough, right, to notice event is happening, which is great if you can do that, but also interpreting it as something needs to be done. But are you yourself going to take that on? Are you yourself going to assume yourself some sort of personal responsibility in what happens? And so also important to remember at every step, like we said before, it really depends on identity at times and other situations and other things around you, other contextual issues that are going on that determine and help contribute to whether you'll intervene or not, or attempt to intervene or not. The question that I would ask everyone to think about when you are starting to weigh assuming a personal responsibility is what's your why, right? What's your why in terms of your engagement in your bystander intervention? As a staff and faculty member, when you notice wrongdoing or injustice happening, not only to your students, but to your colleagues, what is your why? What is your motivation for intervening? And if you're not assuming that personal responsibility, if your answer is witnessing something and then saying to yourself, well, I'm not sure that that's my place to get involved, not necessarily just trying to judge yourself for that, right? But as Cho mentioned, unpacking that for yourself. What is it about this situation that's making me feel so removed? And is it because that I have something to lose as well, right? And are you weighing those sorts of things? So really digging into what's your why. I know some examples for what's your why that people have named are things like just wanting your students to feel safe in your classroom, or wanting to, don't yourself want to be harmed by microaggressions, but you also don't want others to be harmed by microaggressions and other forms of oppression, right? Maybe you want to be seen as a reliable ally for your students and even colleagues or people in society. And so one of the big things to really be asking yourself in this way is just, what is your why? And feel free, if you want to share that with each other in the chat, feel free to write that in the chat. Why do you want to intervene? Why do you want to assume that personal responsibility? What is your why when it comes into this? And I see some comments also about digging into, is this performative allyship are you engaging in, which I think is really important. I see a lot of conversations around just power and privilege happening, so I appreciate you all engaging with all of those things. So continue to maybe ask yourself, what is your why, and are you assuming that personal responsibility? If you're not, what is the reason for that?
I love that. And I think alongside that question of accountability. So how am I going to hold myself to that value? If that's how I'm authentically engaging and that's my why, then how do I hold myself to it? How do I make sense of when I don't intervene? That's great. I'm going to go to the next slide. So.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate the comment from Suzanne, but just about what if I could be brave enough to make a difference, right? And so really appreciate some of the things being reflected on there. So kind of moving forward to a brief recap, we've talked about these first three steps, right? Noticing that event, How is identities and other contextual factors influencing that? Interpreting something as a problem, same sort of steps of that internal work. What are we noticing around us? What are we noticing within ourselves? And then assuming that personal responsibility. So now when we get into the last few steps, we're really going to spend the rest of the time unpacking sort of understanding how to help. So how do you know what to do and how to actually intervene? And then also, you know, that implementation, not only in specific circumstances, but even the conversations you might carry from this with your other colleagues or family members or friends, other people in what we would call your sphere of influence, right? Who do you have influence around or over or with to discuss bystander intervention, to discuss identity, to discuss the important reasons we need to notice these things and do something about it, right? So when we sort of really delve into this though, throughout the rest of the way, just really be checking in with yourself before you do things, right? Before you even intervene, just checking in with yourself about where you are and how you're doing before you kind of move forward.
Mm-hmm. And with that, before we kind of move from knowing how to help into actually implementing the help, it's really important that we take a moment to pause and do exactly what Saeed said, take stock, check in with ourselves. So before we intervene, there's some important questions we really need to ask ourselves. The first one is absolutely, am I safe? And I think, of course, this can mean physically safe. So this could be looking around, checking your exits, but we also mean psychologically and emotionally safe. So is this moment, is intervening in this going to evoke more trauma for me? Do I have the capacity for a teaching moment? If I speak up in this way, do I feel like I'm gonna have a certain safety net around me? And if not, then maybe it's a choice to not intervene and to know that that's okay because your safety is a priority. If you're not safe, you can't be helping others, right? The next question that we want to ask ourselves is, what resources do I have? Because when we think traditionally of kind of that gut feeling we get, knowing we need to jump into intervene in a moment, I think we often think that first it's very automatic. So I need to do it right away. And also, often we also think about it being very individual. So I need to do this myself. I need to do it on my own. And very frequently there are people around us who are resources to us. So looking around, noticing what pathways are around me, what physical objects may be here that I could use to maybe distract from the moment, but also, you know, what people are around me. So what other bystanders are here? Maybe I'm in a crowd of people. Maybe I was traveling with a friend. Maybe there's a friend of a friend that's standing next to them. Maybe there's a CTA driver or a bartender or, you know, someone else who's in this station with me. But noticing what's around can be incredibly important. The third question that we're going to ask is, can I de-escalate this moment? And this is, I think this is really important in all situations and can be meaningful because even to have teaching moments, often we do need to be in a kind of state of mind where we can hear and be open to that. But especially important as we think about stranger interactions and intervening in moments in public, maybe where you don't have a personal relationship to someone. We do know there can be higher rates of violence when you intervene in those situations. So really thinking about de-escalation as one of our preventative techniques. So in that moment, sometimes just being able to present like a very calm exterior, kind of using a lower tone of voice can be helpful. Sometimes it's also really valuable to also, again, bring in other people or others who might be able to kind of separate or, again, just kind of soothe the moment a little bit more. And then the last question that we really want you to ask is, how does my privilege, power, positionality, influence, authority, role, whatever it might be, how does that impact my ability to intervene in this moment? And how do I maybe even leverage that in the moment? So especially as faculty and staff, we have a lot of power. The weight of our words, the weight of our action has a lot more weight sometimes on students than even their peers do. So being able to use that and know that your role as a professor or a staff actually is very important can be helpful. And then we also talked about identity. And I'll just share a brief example because I think this can be hard for us to envision. But an example of using our identity or our privilege within an identity for me might be, so I identify as cisgender. One of the colleagues that I previously worked with is non-binary, and they use they, them pronouns. And when I would be in trainings with them, one of the things that would happen is that they would be frequently misgendered, literally by anyone asking a question about anything. And the impact on them was this constant weight of having to educate, of having to comfort people for their mistakes. And so what ended up happening was, as an ally, as an active bystander, as someone in relationship with someone else, I began to take on that labor for them. So when they were misgendered in any setting, I would go ahead and either pull that person aside to talk to them or correct them in front of everyone, say, just as a reminder, it's they, them. Really so that I could take on some of that labor, because the impact on me was quite different. So for you and your own identity, perhaps as a white person, perhaps as an able-bodied person, as someone with citizenship, as someone who even maybe has access to class and is coming from an upper class background, you have an ability to play a slightly different role that helps to share and disperse that burden. So that is really what you need to be thinking about, the questions we need to engage before we can even jump into this moment to actually intervene. But then once we do, we want to give you a toolkit for what are some strategies. So this next slide will share some of those.
Joe, we just got a question from somebody, if you want to address in the chat, but in that specific situation that you just mentioned, do you ask for that person, your colleague who's being misgender identified, do you ask them permission to educate others before you do it for them?
Yeah. I think it's a really good point and question. I'll say in my situation, yes, absolutely. I talked to them first. I pulled them aside and I said, I noticed this is an experience that seems to be happening. You continue to be misgendered. I don't know if that's a choice to not be sharing your gender pronouns, but if that's something that is uncomfortable, know that I'm seeing that and that I'm happy to play a role in doing this if you're comfortable with that. And I would really recommend for a lot of people that I think that does often provide comfort and agency for the person. When we are intervening in these moments, we want to try to intervene in ways that don't create additional harm. And sometimes making choices or taking away someone's agency to be able to choose how they navigate situations is one way that we can enact harm. So that's something that we do want to be thoughtful around. Thank you for that question and that point.
Yeah, great question. And just mentioning that to other people too, when you do check in, oftentimes that can be seen as a way that you're visibilizing someone or a situation where someone might be being invisibilized, right? If someone is engaging in microaggressions against somebody, or me for that example, and someone else that even has more maybe power in that situation, whether it be a supervisor or identity power, right? Maybe someone, if I'm being, on the receiving end of something racist, right? And I have a white colleague with some power that says something to me and notices that can go a long way as well, right? To help me feel visible, so I don't carry that necessarily just on my own in that moment, wondering if anyone else is realizing what's going on.
Yep, and there's always that balance too of, we're not tokenizing as well. So if you have absolutely no relationship with that person, if it's completely inauthentic, maybe that's not the way to engage. Maybe it's asking a friend of a friend whether or not they're familiar with the comfort level of that happening, or just being like, I notice this, do you know if this is a problem? So also using some judgment around that I think is important. But to get us started on the toolkit, these are 5 different strategies that we recommend you start. And this is not all encompassing by any means, but this can be a helpful thing to recall. All of our tools start with D, and so that's an easy way for us to just even drill and kind of remember, so that we're in that moment and we want to turn away, we can still think of some way to intervene. So maybe I can start with direct, Saeed, and then we'll just go back and forth.
Sounds good.
First one is direct. So this one is maybe what you might think of more traditionally when you're thinking about a bystander intervening. An example could be kind of jumping in and breaking up a fight, or it could be talking directly to a colleague who's been saying offensive jokes or comments in the workplace. So that is an example of direct.
And then we have delegate. So delegate just is what it is, right? Asking others around you for help. And so really the importance of asking others around you to help you also helps create the atmosphere and the knowledge that, hey, intervening is also a community experience. It's not just me on my own over here. It is maybe a lot of our responsibilities in this space to do something about it. And we know that when things go from an interpersonal or an individual then interpersonal level to a more community and societal level, then that's where we can invoke the most systemic change and lasting change, right? So just remembering that you have other folks around you. This could be anything from if you notice something happening at a bar, right? Maybe flagging the owner of the bar or a bartender that's there, or if you're noticing something going on in the street, just maybe you're at a party, maybe engaging the host of the party in some issues that you're seeing at that party, right? It could be a number of things. Engaging your colleagues if you notice something in a work meeting. Similar to what Cho was just talking about, maybe in that situation, you can ask a boss, another colleague, someone else for some help in how to address some of the issues that you're seeing in front of you. So just remembering that delegating is a big piece of this, and remembering how does your identity impact your ability to even think of delegating as an option, because what we do know is that men in particular is the group that stands out the most, that tend to go at this alone and really go into a more direct place as opposed to a more delegating place. The other thing to remember about delegating is that can also be a little bit more diffusing at times and help diffuse some of the tension as opposed to directly going up to someone who's engaging in harmful behavior and trying to have that one-on-one with them. So again, how are you engaging with this toolkit based on your identity?
Absolutely. The third one on here is distract. And that's really just diverting attention from the situation that's happening, maybe from the people who are directly involved, and kind of redirecting that attention somewhere else to stop or prevent the harm from continuing. So an example of this could be something like maybe you notice that someone is being maybe someone is having a conversation where they feel like they're being targeted, or you hear some microaggressions coming up, and clearly it's a situation where the individual is no longer comfortable. Maybe it's coming in and just asking them a question, being like, hey, can I pull you aside? I have a quick question about this class, or you know, this thing about that was happening earlier. I wanted your advice for a student I'm working with, but finding some way to kind of interrupt what's happening. Another example could be just redirecting the conversation even, maybe moving the topic from something that's more sensitive to something else to give them some breathing room, and then checking in later. Which actually brings us to our last one.
Yeah, so delay. So we definitely have this option of delayed. So a lot of folks don't think about delayed intervention, but all it means is that after something has already happened, you can continue to really get into what's going on, how is somebody doing, really just checking in with them. Again, Cho's example before, maybe potentially checking in with someone after harm has been caused, right? In care, when we talk about working with survivors of sexual violence, one of the ways that you can intervene is by checking in on that person that you think harm has been caused to, or that you do know directly harm has been caused to. So checking in with them, how are they doing? Checking in if there's any help that you can provide. But this also means maybe checking in with a person that has also caused harm. So if someone themselves has engaged in maybe a problematic joke or some other kind of harm to a colleague or a student, being able to pull that person aside and saying like, hey, I noticed this dynamic, and this is what I'm noticing and how harm I think was caused. And so that's a really important piece of this all as well, is just remembering that just because you missed the opportunity to prevent something specifically that happened doesn't mean that it's over. And as a matter of fact, folks' ability to really process through the own harm that they've felt oftentimes hinges on the first few people that actually try to engage them to help them, right? So we know the prognosis for even survivors of sexual violence and their ability to process through that oftentimes can depend and be set into motion by just the first person they disclose to, or the first person that notices that they need some help, right? So that's a really important piece to be remembering this as well. Did you want to touch on the document one then?
Sure. Yeah, the last one we have on here is document. And so I think often when we think about this, we might think of like a formal bias incident report or something maybe more formal. That's absolutely a strategy. Another one is just documenting through photography, through screenshots of online harassment. but being able to in some way take information. Sometimes this is, for students even encourage like sometimes note taking. So if they've observed a moment, being able to maybe even reflect or journal down like facts that they've noticed, so that they have that information. It's really important to make sure that we're collecting that information as a bystander, but we are not using it. So we are not necessarily doing things, again, to that question of agency, we're not doing things without the permission of the person who's impacted, but it is valuable as a bystander to collect that information in case they would like to be able to use that. So actually, as Saeed was talking about sexual assault, that's a really wonderful example of being able to collect information as a bystander, hang on to that information, and then provide it to the survivor if they would like to be able to use that later for their own purposes or for a legal process down the line. Something really important is to, again, like always ask and check with that documentation. So even if you're filming things in the moment, don't be sharing those or sending those out and doing other things, again, to that point of agency and control that the person has. And, you know, not posting publicly. Yeah, Saeed?
Joe, just kind of curious, because I know we get this question sometimes, especially with what's going on right now, right, with social media and taking cell phone videos, right, of racism and other things that we're seeing, or even putting examples like screenshotting and sharing of folks being racist, right? Any thoughts on that in particular around like, well, should I be trying to get permission from the person in this video, or the power of cell phone videos in general? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly have some like personal thoughts around it. I think it's hard because there are absolutely moments where, and we've seen it in the past 2-3 weeks, right, where the visibility and having some of that is powerful and can be strategically used. And so we see movements that have been built and continued through seeing documentation. And I think it's important for us as individuals to really consider, like, what is the purpose of sharing? How is that information going to be used or misinterpreted? Because a lot of times there's also no control that we have once it goes into a very public sphere. So if we're talking about harm reduction, I would say then we want to think about asking ourselves those questions. Is posting this going to be helping? Is this going to be supporting the cause or the movement that I'm in? And if so, how am I being responsible about this? What are the unintended consequences that could come? Are there alternative ways for me to use this documentation that might be more helpful? And I think those are questions that, you know, there aren't right and wrong answers to all the time. So really making sure that you also crowdsource for responses and for feedback around that before making those choices as an individual is incredibly important. Thanks, Saeed, for raising that.
Of course, yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning just the intentionality of it all, for sure.
Yeah, and I think one thing we want to mention about this toolkit too is just that this is like a menu. You can combo meal it, and so it's actually much better and more effective if you're using multiple of these tools. So maybe, again, in the moment with my colleague, maybe that was something where I delayed, so they were misgendered. I waited and I checked in on them. Then maybe it's something I'm directly talking to them about and having a conversation around. Is this something that, how do you want to address what's going on? Then maybe I'm delegating and connecting with some of my colleagues and saying like, hey, this is coming up and this is how we're going to address it as a team. And maybe I am, you know, coming back and coming back to that moment again with another delay. But in whatever form you want to use it, these are all strategies that we recommend.